Senator Milne.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to support the recommendations in the committee report. It is a decision which should have been made before any such deal with Russia was signed in the first place. It was very clear leading up to APEC last year that the Russians were receding from any notion of democracy and engagement, but instead were going back to the old KGB days under Putin, President Putin, and now the Prime Minister. And that is obvious. And I am not surprised to hear from a coalition. It was Bob Menzies, after all, who thought that profits from pig iron to Japan were such a great idea, and look where that got us. And precisely, we are seeing here today exactly the same thing. Here we are hearing the profits for Western Australia. Senator Cash thinks, oh yes, the income to Western Australia, fabulous. Senator Birmingham, bring in the money. Bring in the money. We don't care about human rights. We don't care about global peace. We don't care. We don't care about foreign policy. And I love it when they take me on climate change, because a bag load of people who know nothing about climate change, never engaged on climate change, and now they want to talk to me about climate change. Let me tell you something, Senator Cash. Senator Cash, Prime Minister Putin wants to be the energy czar of
Senator
Europe.
Milne, resume your seat. Senator Milne, will you care to direct your comments through the chair? Senator Milne.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I would point out to the Senate that Prime Minister Putin wants to be the energy czar of Europe, and that is because Russia is so rich in energy and it just turns off the tap and Europe quakes. And so to suggest here today that Russia needs this uranium to be able to meet its obligations in terms of energy supply is an utter and absolute nonsense. Let me go first of all to displacement of Russian uranium to Iran. Now, we have heard from the opposition that the safeguards are fabulous. It's all in place. So tell me, why is it that the IAEA cannot guarantee that the reactor in Iran is being built for civilian purposes? The reason they can't is because they don't know, because the safeguards are so weak, because there is so little money going to the IAEA to actually implement safeguards that it is a joke. And if you can't say whether that Russian-built reactor in Iran today is capable of producing plutonium at weapons-grade material, then you most certainly can't trust the Russians. I would also point out that at the moment in Russia, under the Putin regime, and let's not fool ourselves about who's running Russia, we have human rights abuses on a gross scale. We have Larissa Arup, a young activist in a psychiatric institution, a regression back to the punitive psychiatry of the old days. We have the murder and bashing of activists outside the Angas nuclear facility, where Australian uranium will be going. And that might be all right for Senator McGauran, it might be fine for Senator Cash and Senator Birmingham, but I don't think it is all right for anti-nuclear activists to be bashed outside and killed outside a facility that Australian uranium would be going to. Furthermore, NGOs in Russia are being suppressed. Alternative political parties are being suppressed. Khodorkovsky remains in jail throughout the Duma elections. Why? To suppress the democracy movement in Russia. You only have to look at what's gone on in Chechnya, in Georgia. We know now the Russians are supplying passports at a great rate in the Crimea. And what an irony, 100 years after the First World War caused by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in that region, that we have got the Russians sending in those passports at in huge numbers in order to justify later an armed incursion into the Ukraine, which is where this is headed. And we all know that's where this is headed. So to be suggesting that this is somehow some unadulterated good deal is ridiculous. We know about human rights suppression, we know about aggression, we know about how the secret services in Russia are disposing of people in all kinds of institutions and ways. What about the journalists? The most dangerous place in the world for journalists, assassinated for any kind of adverse reporting. We had Grigory Paskov jailed for 5 years because he dared to report that the Russians were dumping nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean. Jailed for that. And apparently the coalition thinks that that's fine, that's transparent. We're not worried about journalists being assassinated. We're not worried about journalists being jailed for reporting what's happening to nuclear waste. We're not worried about what the Russians are doing in Iran. We're not worried about suppression of NGOs, suppression of the democracy movement, jailing of large scale of people like Khodorkovsky, and he was jailed not for tax fraud but because he was financing the democracy movement in Russia. We have got a globally dangerous situation with the Russians at the moment. The Europeans know it, the Americans know it. Everybody is now discussing what to do about Russia. This is not a trivial matter in the manner that it is being trivialised by the coalition today. This is not. I find it completely offensive that you have Senator McGauran referring to people giving evidence to this inquiry as Fruit Loops, for example, or people suggesting that there's anything in it when we talk about the inadequacy of the safeguards. At the very least, Professor Rothwolf from ANU put out last year before APEC that at the very least we could have signed the additional protocol. That would have been an improvement in the safeguards. That wasn't even required by Prime Minister Howard at the time, not even the additional protocols. Furthermore, the Europeans put into every treaty with the Russians human rights, so that in the event that human rights are abused, they can then question whether the treaty proceeds. Prime Minister Howard was not prepared to put human rights into that treaty because he knew, as we all knew, that human rights are being abused in Russia every day. That should have been in there at the very least, and it was not. And I might also point out to the coalition that on his way to Australia for APEC, President Putin at that time called into Indonesia. Why? Because he wanted to sign a new weapons arrangement with Indonesia whereby the Russians will provide the Indonesians with weapons, and made it clear to the Indonesians that that would not be conditional on human rights. Not be conditional on human rights. Why? Because the Indonesians need to access weapons and they don't want to be scrutinised because of the human rights abuses that might be going on, or however they want to handle their own domestic affairs. And that should be a very clear signal to Australia that sending uranium to Russia, where you cannot verify what happens to it because the IAEA is not funded to be able to do that, where even if you do send it to a facility which you could guarantee it will displace Russian uranium into the weapons program and to be supplied overseas to reactors like that in Iran. This was obvious last year. And I am interested to know why the government has changed its perspective, because at APEC the Labor Party was right there with Prime Minister Howard saying how fabulous President Putin's deal was and fawning away as with the rest of them. However, I am at least pleased now that what has gone on in Russia has come across the radar of the Labor Party and that the government now realises just how dangerous this regime is, and I appreciate the fact that this treaty is now on hold. But I think it is really important that, adding to the conditions here, ought to be that no treaty should proceed without it being conditional on human rights and the advancement of democracy. That is what the European Union put in their treaties. That is what we should put in our treaties if we are serious about being anything other than a greedy country seeking to maximise the income from our resource extraction regardless of human rights and democratic outcomes. And I would like to see that as an additional condition when the government reconsiders this particular arrangement. And I think the photograph of Prime Minister Howard shaking hands, the great agreement with President Putin, the great reception in Australia, that photograph will come back to haunt this country and particularly to haunt this coalition for a long time into the future.